We today are going to be talking about concrete strategies for sustainability that are creative, right? Thinking a little bit outside the box. So today you're going to hear from three amazing panelists about what they've been doing and how they're thinking about sustainability. I want to remind folks that we have the app, and I have my phone up here, so you all can ask questions, and we're just going to have a conversation, and I'll really try and integrate your questions. So as you have questions, please text them up here or into the app. I'll ask them, and then as well, we'll save some time at the end for question and answer where we'll have a live mic. So to get started, I just want to do a very quick introduction of our three amazing panelists. So here we have Jacques Colon, who oversees the City of Tacoma's work in support of Tacoma 2025, a community-informed strategic vision and framework for Tacoma's future. He previously served as the Tacoma-Pierce County Health Department's Health Equity Coordinator for 5 years and also was a middle school science teacher. So, sustainability in teaching. Next to Jacques, we have Lisa Cushatt, who serves as the Program Manager for Central Iowa's ACES 360 Coalition, which seeks to improve the health and well-being of all by empowering communities, organizations, and people to take informed actions to prevent and mitigate the lifelong effects of childhood adversity. Previously, she was the Executive Director at United Ways of Iowa and also has experience teaching. Next to Lisa, we have Dr. Janice Gruendel, who has over 30 years of applied social science experience, crafting state and local policy and practice. She's currently serving in multiple roles as a professor, a fellow, a senior fellow, with all of her efforts now really being focused on advancing a prenatal to age 3 or 4 wellness agenda called What About the Babies that we'll hear more about today. She also has a history working in Connecticut state government and in the governor's office for child welfare and early childhood. So please join me in welcoming our three panelists. So our vision for this panel is to really just have a conversation and hear from these folks about the creative ways they've been thinking about sustainability. So I'm just going to start off by asking folks, when you began planning for sustainability of the initiatives represented, where did you start? Did you have a vision for what you wanted to see in the future?
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Sure. All right. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. And before I get started, just thank you for the work that you do. Just being able to go around and listen to all the amazing stuff that's happening. I just wanted to make sure to thank you all for the fantastic work you're doing. So I'm coming from a little bit of a different perspective where I work in local government and I work for the city manager's office at the city of Tacoma. And the thing that I really want to focus on is that sustainability, we often talk about it as finding funding. And usually that takes the form of federal or state dollars. And what I've noticed is that once you get into a local government and really look behind the scenes, that there are a ton of opportunities for partnership and collaboration that really extend what sustainability could look like. So one of the things that I would say to answer this question, and I'm sure I'll talk more in other questions about this, is I did not have a clear vision of how to create sustainability, but I did have a clear vision of what the end goal was. And then looking and working with the people that you identify as stakeholders, really finding where are the common ground and common values that you can then figure out what partnership and collaboration would look like. Because if you do that, you're able to find ways of braiding funding just from the start, but also looking at sharing space as a way to create sustainability. Looking at partnerships that you wouldn't have thought of to deal with social determinants that you don't have the money to deal with, like housing. So those are some of the things that I would be interested in talking more about, but that's what I would say for now.
Great. And Lisa, can you share a little bit about your initiative?
Yep.
And as you answer the question
Yep.
as well, please. Thanks.
Great. So I work for Iowa ACES 360, and we've been around now for about 8 years. We are a coalition with my role as a half-time contract position. We have a great network of partners who really pull our work together to advance it forward. If you look at our work, most people are surprised that we actually only have a part-time staff. But our work really focuses on how do we use ACES-related data specific to Iowa research, as well as other data sets in our state to prevent and to mitigate that long-term impact of trauma. And particularly related to all of your work, we've been spending the last few years really taking time to look at research around maternal ACEs, parental trauma, and really looking at how can we do support more efforts on the prenatal side. And I should say most of our work is systemic. So in answering the question, the one thing I'd really focus on is at the foundation of our coalition, as well as with our prenatal work today, it was data. And it started out, how do we get Iowa-specific data on ACEs? And that's where we began, and didn't really have any intention to do other work in the future. And over the years, as we have done more and more work, one of the key things we've always come back to is how do we make sure data is our foundation, but also data is part of that end vision? How do we know that not only are we achieving our goals, but what are we hearing from the community as well? So I would really emphasize data as a key piece, informing us, our partners' data, our collaborators' data, what are they doing, and how do we pull all the pieces together to reach that long-term vision?
So I'm Janice Gruendel, I'm the old one. And that means that you've been at it long enough that I can tell you how old the young women are. When we started talking about this with the last Republican governor that we had, which was in 2004, that's not when I started, way before that in the child welfare field, but we, in that governmental context as well, we had a notion that all kids could be, we said fine by 5, ready by 5, and fine by 9. So we were in the birth or the prenatal to 8, third grade reading space. That was 2004. So how old are those babies now? To do sustainability, you got to do this level of math. So they're 15, just to take you off the hook. And for me, then the question of how we do this work has a lot to do with time and urgency and how long it really takes to build the relationships and the knowledge that build on the data that we have, but how in the course of that time, the world changes around us, and so we can be hindered or helped. Right now, we're both, right? We have a tremendous opportunity because of the science that we bring to this and the science related to the data that tells us about the prenatal through 3 period, which is where we are now. So that's sort of truth to power. It takes a while to do this, but if we don't have the faces of those babies and young kids in our mind, we forget that we started 15 years ago and we've made some progress, but you know, there's a really lot left to do. Right now, I'm working in Bridgeport, where I live in Connecticut and have a foot in Charlotte. And we have focused using data in a collective impact context, so I love the first plenary this morning, to look at where this Cradle to Career initiative should focus. And we did the data on the bench points, just like we all do, and we kept pushing back and asking, how soon could we know? What could we know, and when could we have a great impact? We got down to the age of 3. And what our community and parents said, you know, these kids are not where they should be, we think, at 3. And in fact, we got a first data point. So this is the direct question of, did the data drive you forward to your vision, and as you said, and then to the questions about how do we build and sustain this work. So the data point we had came from our Head Start partners. There isn't good data around how kids are doing at 3, partly because we have so many instruments and partly because we haven't figured out how to connect our data, all that stuff, which is really important. We finally had a partner with the Head Start agency who gave us their data for entering 3-year-olds. In Bridgeport, 99% of the kids are free and reduced price lunch, so you have a sense that this city of 140,000 has a very lot of children who are vulnerable. And the Head Start was a good proxy, therefore it was half the kids. So I'm giving you data building points right here. The number we found was stunning. I mean, it was I cried, to tell you the truth. It was that 3/4 of the children at the age of 3 who were entering Head Start didn't consistently meet sort of, well, child developmental benchmarks as measured by Teaching Strategies Gold, and that was the proxy that we had. It didn't surprise people in the city because they knew anecdotally that there were lots of challenges for these families that weren't helping them to go and do what they really should do and wanted to do. So did data drive? You bet it did. Did we push the data back to where we found a point that corresponded with the science, which is why we're here with you today? And then did that data inform the goal? You bet. So let me just take one more second and tell you what the goal was and how it came from the data, and then the sustainability question and how it fits. This community is very brave. It's an amazing community that's been sort of discarded by Connecticut as, can't do anything. Can't do anything in Bridgeport. Surrounded by great wealth, as some of your communities probably are. So this community decided that 75% of the kids not being on targeted 3 was just simply not acceptable. So they said, well, let's pick a birth cohort data. All babies born beginning in 2018, right? So how long ago is that? 15, 18, 19, 20. Come on, you gotta help me here. Like 18 or 19 months. And we want them to hit their developmental markers. So basically what they said was, let's flip the data. I love that goal. But then what they said, let's flip it in 3 years, right? Those babies should be more on target in their social emotional development, their physical development, their cognitive, all those domains that we measure. Well, that's a little scary as a goal, which is why I call it brave. But the data we found matched the anecdotes they had, which drove the goal. And then around that, they built a framework because they didn't think one program could fix this, and they were right. So we have a kind of design. You have it here. It looks like this. Please look at it. It's easy reading. And that drove us to what do we need to build, who needs to build it, how do we find community assets, and then how do we get the money to start and the money to sustain. So I'm sorry that's a long-winded answer, but it's a kind of complicated place. We've been together for 3 years.
Well, I mean, I think sustainability is really complicated, right? And it goes back to, I think, Jacques, you mentioned it, oftentimes folks think financing, that's sustainability. But a couple of the things that I heard from you all and that I heard this morning from Paul was the importance of data-driven strategies and community-driven strategies. And I heard, Lisa, you talk about that as well, and Janice as well. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about how you, in your work, have brought the community and the government, right? We have folks who are in government, we have folks who are in community. How do we bring folks together around data and around a common agenda to really help move and form the foundation that we can move forward with sustainability? Big question. It was like a 3-part question, so,
Well, I don't know if I'll hit all the pieces, but in our coalition, we often go back to saying it's all about relationships. And so when we are starting, whether it's a new initiative or continuing work, we always go back to how do we cultivate the relationships at the table. So rather than go to, say, a partner, and I'm actually going to give the example of faith-based communities. We've been doing some work in faith-based communities lately. Rather than go to a partner and say, we want you to do X, Y, and Z to help the community and help your parishioners address trauma. That is not the way to go about it. And we often have this ability to say to communities, here is the data, here's the evidence-based practice, and here's what you should do about it. And so with our faith-based work, we took the approach of one, rather than us having an invite list to a conversation, we asked all of our partners and all of our coalition members to say, who would you invite? Either personal connections or professional connections. Who would you invite that is a faith leader, a clergy member of various faith traditions across our community? And our invite list kind of reached out organically, and I didn't even know probably 90% of the folks that were invited. And then all of a sudden we had this great gathering and had some conversations about what other communities were doing around faith-based work. We've had a smaller group that's continued to meet, but we always take it with the approach of, you are driving this. This is not about us coming and telling you what your faith community needs or should be doing. You know the folks in your area, you know the folks that you serve, you know the folks in your faith tradition, and you're already a resource for them. And so allowing them to help identify and create how they wanted to support individuals. Is the data still there? Yes, absolutely. But cultivating that relationship and being the resource. And then I would say, just beyond that example, overarchingly with relationships, when we look at things like financing, I very rarely apply for any sort of funding or talk about braiding funding if I don't have an existing relationship over a long period of time with who we are asking funding for. That means that they've been to speaking engagements, that means they've been at tables, that they've been part of the conversation before we ever talk to them about the money piece. Same way with our data partners. Our data partners, whether it's Iowa ACES data or another data set, we have engaged with a relationship over a long period of time and have helped co-create what that looks like. As we're trying to figure out the sustainability of our own coalition right now, we've taken a lot of time to meet with our partners along the way and say, what's your vision for where we want to be in the next 5 years? And those are skill sets that all of you in this room have, whether you're doing direct practice or you're doing organizational leadership. And I think sometimes we forget that when we're doing this systemic work and when we're planning for sustainability, we sort of forget that key skill that we have that we need to bring to the table. And it's why many folks got into this work. And I think with overarchingly with these conversations, we need to lead with what's often our best asset, and that's our ability to build relationships. I have no idea if I answered your question.
Yeah.
Relationships.
Relationships.
Sure. That's awesome, and that's exactly where we were. So I'm not going to say those things because I couldn't be nearly as good and succinct. I will tell you 2 strategies and tools that we used, because sometimes in the space it's helpful to have a way to engage. So I already told you we had a data point that sort of made us all a little agitated. At the same time, we were significantly and intentionally poking around in the neuroscience literature about early brain development and brain development through 25 or 26, about the impact of trauma and adversity on that development, particularly in the early years, and then out the other end of what makes us strong and mindful and centered internally, but also in positive relationships. That was the frame. The tool we used was the documentary Resilience. And we used it in short forms and long forms, and y'all can use it, and you've probably done it already. But that was our opportunity to give something, and it was an organizing way for folks to come together and just be together. That documentary brings you together. One-offs don't work in ways that help you have relationships and conversations that are really hard at the community level. The other tool we used, which we were in the process of building, was a customization of I will call it a program. It's called the Boston Basics. Does that ring a bell to folks? You should Google it. It comes from, I'm a Yaley, it comes from those Harvard people, and how could you, I'm sorry. Anyway, it's a video series that's free, it's online, and it's science-based. 5 things every family could do to help their children sort of grow and to help families be strong. So we had those 2, we licensed it, we customized it, and we were infusing it throughout the community with all kinds of partners. So those 2 things together were our campaigns to move, and then we partnered that with what you said, which is the community building, rebuilding relationships that we needed to have to get to the harder questions about what does this mean and what should we do and how do we do it.
So data and community engagement, I would say on the data side, what is data actually doing for you? And from a sustainability perspective, there's a couple of things that it should be doing for you. I don't know if you all have ever heard the quote that strategy is the art of knowing what not to do. In a field like this, there is an unending, infinite amount of good, important work that needs to be done, and we don't have the capacity to do it all. So what data should be helping us do is figure out where are we going to get the most impact, how is that going to happen, and where would good work happen that we need to actually let go. And so if you all are not familiar with GIS mapping as a tool, I would strongly recommend that you find partners in your community that do GIS mapping. If you have a university, they will have a GIS program. If you have a health department, I'm hoping that they have GIS capabilities. But GIS allows you to see by census tract in a lot of cases or zip code where you have higher numbers of whatever it is that you want to look at. And so you may have maps of case numbers by zip code, but how are you actually comparing that to other things that are important to the work that you're doing, like availability of resources or availability of jobs or educational outcomes? How are you actually comparing those things with mapping to be able to answer the question, where do we need to focus our limited resources? The second piece of that is that you will have too much data and not enough time to answer all the questions that you want to answer or to apply for all the grants and opportunities that you want to apply for. So with that, I would say just really be intentional about what are the data pieces that are most important, because there will be useful data that you have to let go because there's just too much data. What are the most important pieces of data? And then how can you actually structure your data to do work for you over time? So if you have a grant writer in your organization or somebody that does the grant writing, how much of their time do they spend repeating, pulling up similar sets of data for different grant opportunities? I will just leave that question out there. Is there a way that you could say, really what we're trying to affect are these 5 social determinants of health, and that data is not going to change? We might need to change a couple of paragraphs for different grant opportunities, but here's the core data that we're going to base all of our grant applications on, because this is the crux of what we're trying to solve as an organization. So that's just a tangible, easy strategy for using data to build sustainability. On the engagement side, I would say, again, what are you doing community engagement for? Because you will never have enough hours to do all of the community engagement, nor should you. And the reality is that that not all engagement is meaningful. So a lot of times we trick ourselves into thinking we have to do engagement. We do what we think is meaningful engagement, and our outcomes don't actually change. In that scenario, you've checked a box process-wise, but you are not actually moving the outcome. And so I would say think really hard about what is your intended outcome with engagement, because that should focus your efforts and free up some capacity. And then the second thing I'll say about engagement is just people do not engage with issues. All right? Community members don't engage with singular issues. And what I mean by that is, if you're thinking about a neighborhood or a community, think about how many different issues they would have to mobilize around and care about to actually do the work that's important to them. And there's not time or capacity to do that. So I'll just say in our community alone, we have one of the largest detention centers in the country. So immigration is a huge issue that folks are organizing around specific to that detention center. Are they talking about 0 to 3 health specifically? No, but I would argue that that is absolutely something that we should be thinking about as a community organizing strategy to think about how can we work with them. And there are similar examples across housing, across food justice, across climate change. Like, we need to start thinking about engagement as an intersectional issue from the end user perspective, as opposed to what issue are we trying to organize for, because that, as we've seen, is very ineffective.
Could I speak to that just for 1 second? Because implicit in both of the things that you said is a paradigm shift for how we do this work. And it's time for that. I can just tell you that being old. The beauty of these conversations is that they focus on community and assets and engagement from an asset perspective. That is, what works for you, what gives you strength in your community, what fills your mind and your heart, what's your story? That's what you heard this morning, right? Everybody's a leader. The shift in that is from where are the deficits in our community to where are the assets in our community, which involves a different kind of data, sometimes messier, but it's inherent in what you have both talked about. I will give you one faith example of data in the space that we talked about. Families, we asked families where they went, and all these families are living at 200% of the poverty level or less, right? So it's challenging. And we have immigration issues and all of that kind of stuff. On the other hand, the neuroscience tells us to find the strength, you have to find the strength. You have to find the assets, the resources that they hold themselves. So they told us they went to churches. That's where they came to find themselves again, to center, to find their social relationships and essentially their social capital. So part of our asset mapping was asset mapping. And we found 128 churches, synagogues, and mosques in this very small city, and nobody even knew that. So it was a paradigm shift for us, deficit to asset. It was an engagement process because now we have found the places that people actually go, and we could map that in a GIS kind of context, so people could look and see, oh my gosh, almost every corner has a place that's safe and positive. So I think as we do this work, if we keep in mind that we're shifting big time, this is a DNA shift, that we'll learn how to do this work a really lot more effectively in support of people who own it, which isn't always us.
I think that it really, what you both have just said, really resonates with what Paul was saying earlier, right? He showed that graphic around what does engagement look like, right? We often do what was on the far right, but we say we're doing what's on the far left. And how do we really meaningfully engage folks in our community around what are the issues, what are, as Renee said, the people who are closest to the problem are the closest to the solution, right? But they're often the ones that lack the resources empowered to make a change. So how do we make sure that we're bringing those two things together? One thing that's really struck me as you all have been talking is around the sustainability, and Lisa, you mentioned this, you said there's the sustainability of the coalition and there's sustainability of practice change, right? And oftentimes I think that when we're doing this work, we're thinking that we're just thinking about how do we sustain the coalition? We know the coalition is creating practice change, right? The work that they're doing, but how do we also think about spreading that, right? Sort of a two-pronged strategy. So, Jacques, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you've been able to do that through your policy work in Tacoma.
Sure. Actually, restate the question one more time for me.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about, and this was not, I'm pulling a Darnisha. This is not a question that we prepped beforehand. So thinking about sustainability, we often think about, I think, in some ways, just sustaining an initiative. How do we sustain this initiative? How do we sustain this coalition? But really also what we're trying to really do is sustain practice change throughout,
And that's
right?
what you want me to focus on, is the practice change.
I mean,
Okay.
you can focus on
I got
both.
it now.
But
I got it now. I was just confused for a second. Sorry. So great point, and I think you all are really keyed in on organizational sustainability. So practice sustainability is really about change management. So if you know anything about change management, there are stages of change management. If any of you have been a teacher, we talked about our teacher background, like you cannot go into a classroom and say, here is the information that you need to learn, walk away and come back and say, did you learn the information? That's not change management, that's change expectation. And a lot of times, a lot of the work that we do, especially in government, is change expectation without change management. So with that, some of the stages are, figuring out what's the common vision, figuring out what the roles and responsibilities are for managing the change, figuring out what is sort of the collaboration points, what are the sticking points that you want to move together. And then being intentional and thinking about who are the allies that you're building. So I would say one of the key parts of change management that people often overlook is the fact that you are not going to be the one doing the changing, right? That you're really being shifted into a servant leadership role where you're thinking about how do I create the conditions where this change can happen for other people. Where can they lead the change? So that involves building leadership in others, right? Different organizations, different partners, different community members. And that's how you sustain the change. So just as a quick follow-up to my last point about community organizing as a change principle, is livable wage jobs, is that a 0 to 3, is that a safe babies issue? Is having livable wage jobs a safe babies issue?
Yes.
Okay. Is early childhood education a safe babies issue?
Yes.
Is access to healthy foods a safe babies issue?
Yes.
Are the leaders in those spaces being engaged and built up as leaders in the safe baby space? I would say rarely, maybe in some cases. So if that's the case, then how do we expect for the change to really start to happen the way that we want it to if we're not engaging the people that are making the change in our communities? Does that make sense? So I would say just in order to maintain change in practice, you have to stay firm to the vision, right? Because if you get a lot of people involved, you have to have your North Star. Otherwise, people start going off in their own directions. So having that North Star, really understanding what your goals are, and then making sure that you are intentionally building the leadership of the community that you want to work with.
And I was going to tag on to that last point with an example. So our coalition, I would say the bulk of our work is around policy or government relations. That's where we spend most of our time. And my previous job is when the ACES movement really started in Iowa. And I remember the very first committee hearing at the state capitol where they were using the term ACES. And for those of us sitting in this committee meeting, one of the senators turned around and he said, well, how do you define adverse childhood experiences? And we all looked at each other because we weren't even sure. We hadn't come to the room with a common understanding of how we were even going to define it. Luckily, someone had wrote the definition in the legislation, so that helped. We could look at it. But I fast forward now to last year where I was getting texts on my phone during a floor debate from some members of our policy coalition because they were excited because a given senator or given representative was not only using the term adverse childhood experiences, but they were using it correctly. So way back when we first started, folks thought, well, I want to do the ACES program, or I want to address this thing, and not really focusing on really the roots of it and how it, and really not only what the data meant, but what it meant to the community and to our state. And it was at that point last year that I looked back on the 8 or 9 years of our coalition and all of the time that we spent cultivating that leadership with some of the elected officials. And it wasn't in a lobbying way, it was just sharing, like, here's the information on our state, here's what it looks like in your community. Having community members and their leaders in their areas, whether they work on early childhood or whether they work in adult corrections, using the same term in the language. Over time now, those leaders have not only started using the term correctly, but now they're using their role to see how it influences policy. I could not have told you 8 or 9 years ago that that's where we would have ended up last legislative session, but I will say it's a really incredible place to be, to know that all those side meetings that we had and all the work that people had done in their own communities, we could finally start seeing coming to fruition. Now, does that mean they're making great policy decisions? Not always, but we at least are now able to speak that same language and try to help foster them to be able to do their role, and that's, they should be doing good policy making, and now we have the ability, I think, to create that.
And I think when you and I had chatted on the phone, you shared some new work and new training opportunities and embedding the ACES work and training into existing systems, which hadn't been done before.
Yeah, so in 2018, the Iowa legislature passed a requirement that all educators have training in suicide prevention and postvention, but they also added to that, also have training in adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress. And I will tell you, we were not even doing work in the education committee. And we were very supportive of children's mental health work, the suicide prevention and postvention work, but with some conversations, this was added, and over the past year, so this is a system where we didn't necessarily want to support unfunded mandates, and so we were able to use our partners to help create some trainings that could be offered for free through the school districts and online. But I think that's, again, an example of folks who really interested in creating change based off of data, but that leadership, as you said, kind of had to be cultivated over time.
Yeah.
And so this is a system, not that many of the schools weren't already doing training on ACEs. It's not like trauma-informed schools was an entirely new phrase to them, but having something actionable come down from the state, but also being able to provide that support. It was a really great example of just that kind of long-term work, and we're partnering in our community how to deliver it, and we're also trying to support other communities to not create new things, but where can they do work based off of their strengths already.
So when we think about sustainability of practice change and really getting it into any sort of policy, whether that's administrative, legislative, et cetera, really strong sustainability strategy. Janice, can you talk a little bit about your experience in terms of leveraging policy across the board? Legislative, administrative, actions you've
No.
done?
Because if I did right now, it wouldn't be true to where the community has been. I mean, I spent my life in policy, so could I? Yes. And would I add maybe little bits and pieces to what people have said? I'd rather not answer that question, so can I answer a different question?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to go back to the sustainability question and the resources question. On account of, we only have like 45 minutes together, right? And I'm going to give you two tools that one we created, one we found. They're asset-based tools that helped us get into the space that sort of ties this all together. I will, if you ask me, and I hope you do, talk about the resource investment portfolio, because that's a tangible way of thinking about both initial investment, not expenditure, and also how we move from launch and innovation into sustainability using most of the funding streams we already have.
Yeah.
So if you ask me that would be great, but I'm not going to answer that this minute. So here are the two tools. One we created. It's really simple and it's kind of silly, but oh my gosh, it works so well. Because there are so many moving parts to making, this is ecosystem change, right? This is DNA, culture change, each strategy all the time. And it has to be both universal and place-based. It has to be, that's how we do this work. We needed a way to help people think in a checklist kind of form. Did I cover my bases? Did I miss somebody? And it's relevant to all of us. We call it the rule of P. There are 7 Ps. It's in both the playbook and the presentation, but let me tell you what they are. And it's not rocket science, but he puts them together and mnemonic helps. So it's people, which is what you all talked about. It's place, which is the context of where we live and work, right? From my neighborhood to my city to my state, which is where policy comes in. It's politics, small p, because that's how policy decisions get made within the context of. That's a really bad grammar, but you know what I mean. So people, places, politics. Then we looked at policies. Then we looked at practices, not in any order. We looked at programs, and the last one was partnerships. Now that seems like a lot, but it's such an easy mnemonic, and as you're doing the work, no matter where you are, to keep that piece of paper in front and say, did I hit them all? Did I hit the most important ones? If I missed one, is that going to be a bad thing or not a bad thing? So the first tool is the rule of P. It's just a list, but it's kind of cool and you can use it to have these conversations. The second one we have liberated from the National Implementation Research Network, which is at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And it's a 20-year-old organization created to help us do the implementation of evidence-based work really well. It's called the Hexagon tool. It's one page, and it asks 6 different questions about the decision-making process. What are you trying to accomplish? Do you have the capacity? Is the community bought in? And on both the site side and the other. Those are 2 tools that help us get to the place that is data-informed and can be sustainable. So I didn't answer your question, but I do want you to have those tools.
That's great. And actually, there was a question that came in around the resource you had mentioned earlier, the name of the video that you were sharing. Can you share that out again with folks?
Yes, ma'am. It's called Resilience. It's Resilience, the documentary, and the full name is it's The Science of Hope, the Biology of Trauma and the Science of Hope. That is a senior moment, folks, because I live with this thing. It's done by the J.K. Pritzker Foundation. It's online. You can get short forms of it for free. If you want to show the whole documentary, someone needs to license it. It's not expensive, and it is stunningly powerful. We have built short forms, long forms. If somebody only has 45 minutes, it's 58 minutes. So, 45 minutes won't do it. You can't show it and run, because it takes you here. It's the universal story of challenge in our lives on which poverty and racism and equity piles on top of. So it leads to amazing conversations that sometimes we don't have, but it should be facilitated. So it should be an introduction, the documentary, and then somebody, a panel or a person who asks you a couple key questions, and people get to talk. And first they breathe and then they talk. So that's the documentary and more than you wanted to know, but boy, it's a life turner. And then when you've done that, read The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke Harris, because she's the doc in the documentary, and the book is beautifully written. It gives you the science and you feel like you know it afterwards. And it really talks to all of these issues from her story perspective. So again, more than you wanted to know, I'm sorry.
Great, thank you. So I want to get back to asking about the resource investment, but I'm going to put a pause in that.
Okay.
And first, I just want to shift the policy question to Jacques and thinking about health equity, right? And how you have worked on sustaining health equity initiatives and that practice change in the policy work that you do from your position.
Sure. It's actually not that different from the rule of P, right? Which is, if you're asking the right questions in the policy development process, then you should be able to build equity into that process. So you've probably seen different forms of racial analysis tools, like racial equity analysis tools, or just any kind of analysis that is done in the policymaking process. And what we did at the health department when I was there was we really pushed a concept called health in all policies, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's essentially that whether you're talking about livable wage jobs or the education system or access to food, we need to be thinking about what are the health impacts of each of these decisions, right? So health, it should be in all policies. And with that concept, what we said was that, everybody's actually really supportive of that. Health cuts across party lines, everybody supports health. I think babies are a similar thing, like everybody likes babies for the most part. And so there's power in that, right? But folks don't necessarily know how to get there, right? And so what I would say is our role in building sustainability into policies is thinking about what processes and what questions can we introduce sustainably into the policymaking process that get us to the equitable outcomes that we're looking for. So what we did to operationalize health in all policies was we created something called the Health Lens Analysis Tool. Very simple 2-page sheet that basically did the P questions. What are you trying to accomplish with this policy? Who are the people that will be potentially impacted by this policy? Who have you consulted with? Who have you not consulted with? And what will be the social, economic, or environmental impacts of the policy? And you can see that by asking those questions, you're not actually using the word equity in any of them, but you are getting at the core roots of what creates inequity or equity, right? Who is being impacted? Are you actually working with them, or are you creating this policy for them without their inclusion? And how is it affecting the social determinants of health? So you can see just in those brief group of questions that you can actually figure out a way to operationalize what equity means in real life through those questions. Is that perfect? No, because you have to then go through change management and figure out who is filling out those forms and how you develop their critical analysis to be able to develop these policies. So just like anything else, you have to not speak it into existence and expect that it will be just so. But you have to work with other people to make sure that it is meaningful, that it will be used well, and that you have buy-in from it. And if I could take like a 30-second side note, I would love to tell you guys a quick story about change management, which I was talking about before, and that is voting, right? So in most of our communities, especially with the census coming up, there's this general sense that civic engagement sucks in general, and that we need more people to vote and we need more people to care deeply about the issues that are happening in their community. Is that like resonating with anybody in their communities? Yes, I see heads nodding. Okay, so if you were to say, I'm going to think outside of the box of how we can improve voting, you might say, oh, we're going to invest in like a Get Out the Vote campaign, and we'll work with different organizations on educating people about voting. That is really limited thinking. So I would say there's another box outside of that box, and that is, why don't people vote? It's not because they don't know that they can vote, right? So if you really investigate why people don't vote, it's because they don't believe that their voice will have an impact. It's because they don't think that their past voices, their past engagement has had an impact. And it's also because they just don't have the experience to know what voting means. So think about first-generation families, right? How are they learning about the voting process? So what we did as a health strategy to improve engagement is something called participatory budgeting, which is, rather than spending that money on an education campaign, you take that money and you give it to the group that you want to work with, and you ask them, what do you want to do with this money? And you actually let them decide. And here's what that does, is it gives them the experience of deciding and voting on something. And then if you think about partnering, like those opportunities for collaboration that I was talking with, we partnered with the Pierce County Auditor, right, the woman that runs the elections in our county, to print off the ballots for these processes on the official elections ballots, to do secrecy envelopes, to bring drop boxes to the schools, and to have a field trip at the elections headquarters with those students that participated so they could count the ballots and think about the impacts that that has on the election center and what they see during the field trip, on the kids and their actual experience of the voting, and then their networks, right, their families that may not be voters, that they will be the ones that will be opening those envelopes. We're a mail-in state, that will be actually looking at those ballots and teaching their parents how to vote for the first time. So that is a different perspective on change management and how to build sustainability into a practice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad you took the 30-second sidebar to tell that
It's probably more
example.
than 30 seconds,
It
right?
was maybe
Yeah.
75 seconds. But I want to go back to, I think that's a good example, and a couple of the things that I've heard around collaboration, working with the communities, building relationships, having an easy sort of, how are we building health equity into policy making, really working to change the way systems structure. And I'm thinking about from the perspective of the infant toddler court teams, who are thinking about what are the impacts of existing systemic structures, policies, et cetera, on children, young children, and their families. And thinking about, is there an opportunity within court teams who are bringing folks together across sectors, across systems, to say, we have a relationship with somebody who's an administrator in child welfare, an administrator in our health system, maybe in the legislation. We've got a checklist. We as a community, we as a court team have come up with, through community engagement, a checklist of things we want administrators to think about around how decisions they make impact young children and their families, right? So it's sort of taking what you all have shared and thinking about, if I can, how it may apply in a direct, really actionable, concrete way to some of the work that we're doing in community now. So for folks who have seen the framework for sustainability that we've done with the Infant Toddler Court Team program, or watched one of the webinars, Can we just get a little hand show? We've done a couple webinars. Okay. So I promise you, they brought up the core components of this framework without me having to share it with them. So we talk about in this framework the importance of a common vision, collaboration, resources, financing, policy, data, continuous learning and evaluation as we're going through this process. We also say all the time that key to sustainability is implementation. And what you're doing at implementation is key to sustainability. So Janice, can you tell us a little bit about the resource investment portfolio and how that really fits into this work and thinking about implementation?
That was a
to
wonderful and
sustainability?
sneaky way. It's a great document, and it's really helpful to have those things in a frame that is useful, that you can pull out. In order to answer the question, I need to tell you what the bundle is. We call this a bundle design. We do it deliberately because we absolutely believe there is no single answer to the challenges that our communities face, whether you're looking at them in a core context or some other context. Here are the 4 pieces, and I'll tell you then how we got to the resource bundle. One quick point on the first. The first is just start with the neuroscience, always, because it's there and we didn't have it a decade ago. So ACEs is important, but ACEs in the context of what's really happening in a child's brain, in the relationship between the parent and the child, and what the parent's lived experience means to the nature of that relationship, and how do you get through to resilience and relational health and inside health. That's the first box. You can do that with anybody. It's universal. That's our resilience piece, and there's just huge information there. My quick story on that is when we first started this work under the old governor, right? So I'm dating myself a little bit. I think maybe 2009 or something. We took the senior judge for the juvenile division with us up to Harvard to think with the Center on the Developing Child, and they showed the documentary Resilience. So this has been around for a while, and I sat next to the judge, and I love her. She was tough as nails, and she had each of those pieces in her mind and was committed to it. So I appreciate the kind of very insightful questions that I've heard here from people who are judges. I'm not biased. My husband is a retired judge, so I kind of have lived that world as well. She sat next to me and she cried. She cried. And she looked at me, just as the documentary, right? No real prep or anything like else. And she said, Janice, we are doing this all wrong. And she came back and began to implement a neuroscience informed, that is start with the brain and what we know and the impacts on it and how do we get through it, into her court training process. So the first of these is all about that. The second of these is that the community gets to pick what it thinks its solutions are, and embedded in that is the resource bundle. So I will go to that. The third piece is it takes organizations to implement whatever the community thinks they want to do. And sometimes it's provider organizations, and sometimes it's churches. I mean, sometimes it's community fairs. There's, it's what is specific to that community. And the last one just says, whatever you do, make sure you have a research partnership and you use implementation science. Because if you do it badly, the message is it doesn't work, even if it's not the fault of whatever you've been building. So those are the 4 pieces. In the community strategies, piece number 2, there are 5 strategies. The fourth, so I'll just tell you what they are because that makes sense. The first is how do we take care and support of parents, whoever they are, grandparents, who's ever doing primary caregiver work. The second one says, man, evidence base is great, but we're doing cool things in the community and you don't even know about it. So that's the deep community piece. The third piece is an army of folks. That's the civic engagement piece, which I really think is important. The fourth one is we need to pay for this somehow. And the fifth says we need to, truth to power, how are we doing, right? Did our population change? Did our processes change? Is it sustainable? On the resource side, people started to think the way we always start, how do I get more money to do this? It's what you said, it always goes to the money piece. And we defined resources differently. Here's how we did it. It's really simple. We said resources are the assets you have. Assets. So I'm repetitive on that point. Here are the assets you can find, your question about what already exists, and here are the assets you can build. So for us, resources is about people and skill sets and practice and dollar resources in actual dollars or other things that look like that. We received in the budget of our departing Commissioner of Social Services with a new governor, so politics, right, in the rule of P, a transfer of funds to fund some contractual help for us to define these resources. We are doing that. We are calling it a resource investment portfolio. We are looking at a whole range of strategies systematically, because building resources means building new resources, rebuilding old resources, and then figuring out how to make this sustainable for families who are very dependent on the government's money anyway. In the presentation, I'm not going to go through all those pieces, but you can. And in the playbook, we talk about what exactly those pieces are and how we're thinking about getting to them. On October 12th, we're going to have a framework. And then we can take that back to the community, which asked for it, and the state, and say, of these pieces, where are we? Does this make sense to you? How do we go forward? So it's not a financial piece of analytics. It is about resources, broadly writ. It is about investment, which is, of course, the same as expenditure, but the word works a lot better with your stakeholder audience. Mm-hmm. And it's about a portfolio, because to fund moving parts, you need lots of ways to be in that space. So that's what it is at this level. But in October, and I will share it with you so you can share it out, we will have it at the 5-foot level in addition to the 25-foot level. So we went at it intentionally as part of the community's desire to resource this thing better than they thought it was.
That's great. And the resource that Janice is referring to is in your app. We have a couple of resources from all of the panelists there that can help ground this, ground some of what they've been sharing with you all. I want to pause and ask for reflections from you all, the strong who have survived till the end of the panel. We appreciate it. What resonates with you from what you've heard today? How does this relate to some of the sustainability work that you all have been doing within your communities and within your infant toddler court teams? Feel free to type it in. Sarah's got a mic. Yes, great.
I'm going to get a lot of steps in this.
My name's Lisa Mansfield. I'm from the Tacoma area. I think one of the main themes that keeps repeating for me anyway is relationships. Mm-hmm. And my mother used to say, in order to have a friend, you've got to be a friend. And we really have to look at how we are in relationship to the people we are trying to create partnerships with. And we also have to understand that it's not just what can they do for us, what can we do for them, and what can we do together.
That's great, thank you. You know, one of the things that I've been struck by is how often collaboration and coordination has come up throughout this conference. And I was looking at Chicago's motto for their initiative. We coordinate because babies can't wait, right? So that coordination is really key to their ability to do the work now and in the future. Pause. Other reflections from folks?
Could I just add one thing to
please.
that? I'm sorry. So when we go through this resilience store, the neuroscience store, one of the presentations, many of the presentations that we do start with this is about the journey from trauma to health. Colon, what's in your backpack? It goes precisely to your issue by calling out that we come to these engagements with a backpack full of lived experiences. We have our own goods and hards and stories, and for me, finding the space that can be a preface, a way to build on the relationships that actually builds us together. So that notion of what's in your backpack is a really good question to ask as part of this process, and I think it goes directly to what you're saying. We contribute because of who we are in this. So it's not okay to say, well, what do we want you to do? It's who are we in that exchange around relational health?
If others want to respond to, please feel free.
I would jump on the don't just ask what you can do for them. If we're talking about the pathway to change is partnership and coordination, and that in order to get partnership and coordination, you need to build relationships. well, what does it take to build relationships? And I think that's the key, is that any relationship is going to become toxic if you are approaching it from just the what can I get out of this perspective. And the same is true with professional partnerships. So very much agree with that sentiment, that you have to have a spirit of true partnership and not of trying to extract value from others in the community to accomplish your goal.
Yeah, and I would just add, particularly with our policy work, but with our work overall, anytime we start, whether it's a meeting or work or planning a legislative agenda, we always remind folks that we are here at the table to do together what none of us can do alone, and that is the purpose of us coming together. Everyone has their own agendas, their own personal reasons for coming to the table, but we really try to emphasize that when we are together, we talk about the power of the group together and our relationships together and how we're going to move work forward.
That's great. Thank you. Other thoughts, reflections?
Thanks. I'm Carrie Toy. I'm in Florida. I've actually had a couple of reflections as I've been sitting here. One, we're very fortunate in Florida to have a statewide data collection system with few data elements so that we can really stay focused on our mission, timely permanency for infants and toddlers. So we've been very fortunate to have great partnerships across the state, helping us look at our data, analyze it, determine what we need to do to move forward, and making improvements. And then we've also had we've been lucky to the legislature allocated some funding for an evaluation. We just got the results back showing that, we're doing okay with implementation across the state, but we have a lot of work to do. One of our big learning lessons right now, I think, that we're facing is the need for ongoing training. So we did a lot of really robust, hardcore training on early childhood courts and what the Safe Baby Court Team approach is at the beginning. And we had everybody on board in doing this, but then because of issues like turnover or really just getting comfortable in your everyday way you're doing things and kind of forgetting what the mission is, we're seeing where we're struggling quite a bit in different areas. So those are our learning lessons as far as making sure we're not just getting comfortable with what we've, it's one and done. It's that ongoing need for refresh and bringing people back together and focusing again on those relationships both within the communities and because I'm doing statewide work around the state as well. So one of the things we're working on now is identifying our in-state experts because we've been working on this approach for quite some time now. We have our own in-state experts that we consider leaders and look forward to, instead of it just being a set number of us who've been doing this kind of training over the years, tapping into those other leaders and champions across the state to really help to build this up for us in the spirit of sustainability.
Thanks, Carrie. So that leads for me a question I'm wondering your all thoughts on is around, so how do we deal with turnover, right? How do we deal with turnover when we're thinking about sustainability? How does that play into sustainability planning? It's something that happens, right? We all know that there's high rates of turnover in child welfare. How do we think about turnover when we're also thinking about sustainability?
I'll be really brief. Build your bench. So in sports, like, you're going to have turnover. Like, think of it, if you're baseball fans, if any of you went to the game last night, if you're a AAA team, your best talent is going to get poached by the big leagues eventually. That's the hope. And you're going to get new folks coming in from single A or AA ball. So your goal as a AAA team is to build the bench so that you are actually supplementing when there is turnover. And then if the major league team decides to trade somebody important, they have a AAA player that they can bring up. So the same thing is true of our organizations, except we don't build our benches. We're not thinking about who our AAA clubs are. And so I would just say, as you're thinking about how you're building leaders in the community, those should be the same people that you're thinking about grooming to take those positions in the future.
Thank you.
Yep. I would state two things. One, from not only a human resource perspective, but from a moral perspective, we really have to do a much better job on self-care around those we work with. So that means your peers who you sit next to day to day, to want to address the burnout and to address some of that turnover, but not doing it just because we want them to stay in that seat, but doing it because they are people who came to this work because they care deeply about the community, and realizing there's that responsibility to each other. So some of that's internal to organizations, some of that's coming to systems and saying we need to think about how we are talking about the child welfare workers in the community and in the state, and they're doing incredibly hard work in our state with incredibly high caseloads. And what can we do to support them and to support the role? So I think there's, to some extent, an HR piece in that, and just how are we supporting folks today? There's a lot of great information about that right now, but it needs to be not just a thing we do whenever we have time to do a self-care training. It needs to be embedded within organizations and systems to do that. And I think that not only addresses some turnover now, but it also helps keep the bench even there. And then to tag on to what you were saying, in our community, we have a private foundation who just did a health policy fellowship, and the intent was to how do we cultivate leaders working in an advocacy and systems field, and I think that's a really wonderful and unique thing that I and some of my colleagues have got to be part of. But it goes to that idea of building the bench. And I think that has to come internal to organizations, but it has to come from the community as well. Because when this private philanthropy came to do this work, they weren't doing it within their office. They were looking out into the community and say, who is at different tables who, they may not be the leads of organizations, they may not be the face of an organization, but they are very much doing the work, and in the future they're going to be leading, and we have to build up capacity support, and I think in some cases the voice and their ability to have voice.
Other reflections, and I'll just also open it up now for just any questions for our panelists.
This is okay because we're standing between everybody and
I
their
know.
airplane.
Yeah, I know. So I'm gonna ask the final question then, and if we could hear a final thought from each of you around sustainability, lesson learned, a charge for those who have stuck with us.
I will say that something that has impacted my thinking that I think applies here is a quote that transformational change cannot happen with transactional efforts. I think very often when we talk about sustainability or big picture things like this, we often jump to transactional changes that we can make, like little tweaks to systems or program changes. Those things are good, but they're actually not going to lead to the transformational changes that we're looking for. And so I think you've heard from the panel a lot of talk about relationships and thinking about engagement in different ways, thinking about sustainability in different ways. All of that is really to say, don't settle for transactional efforts. That if you are seeking transformational change, that requires relationship and it requires transformational action.
I would just go back to my earlier comment on how we frame our work, that really think about when you are sitting at a table and with your collaborative groups and sustaining for the future. Again, think about what all of you can do together that you can't do alone. And I think that when you continue to come with the framework, sustainability is not necessarily easier, but you're at least all on the same page and working together a bit more cohesively.
Thank you.
I'm going to leave you with 6 thoughts really fast. I can do it in exactly 5 or 6 seconds. Well, okay, maybe 15 seconds. 1, there is an exquisitely painful time gap between the urgency to improve safety and nurturing for babies and their families and the resources to ensure that that happens. It is a painful experience and it takes time. That's the first learning on this, so self-care is a pretty good way to deal with that. The second is that building resource development leaders requires strong, effective communication strategies and a framework plus trusted relationships. That's the leaders piece and the bench. The third piece is a caution, don't get sucked. That's a highly technical psychological term. Don't get sucked into current funding thinking that is only program-based and often siloed. That's the easy way, it just doesn't work. The fourth one is do your homework. Build a systematic framework for resource development and sustainability. Don't do it helter-skelter, which is why we are having this conversation. The fifth one I really care deeply about. Find your own voice and convey your passion, because that's how people engage. You have to be naked in this process at some point, and that's a good thing. The last one is be brave. Really, no doesn't always mean no. Honestly, sometimes it just means pause, and sometimes it means find another door. So be a gorilla, be brave. And from me to you, thank you. This was an extraordinary experience for me, and it takes me back to my child welfare roots, and I thank you for that opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Janice. So folks can join me in thanking our panel.